You can tell a lot about a community with how they treat their poor, widows, and orphans. Tonight, we talk about the history and haunts of the former Claremont County Infirmary, a once massive institution that saw over a century of progress in social institutions, attitudes, and social welfare. And as rumor has it, some of those previous residents never left the property. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful episode of the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities Hometown Haunts podcast. I'm your host, Kat Cloco, and along with me on this exploration into the unknown is Jen Kohler and Christina Wald. Woo! We went on some fun explorations yesterday, and we will talk about it in a little bit. You can stay up to date with us and our show by following us at Sin Cabinet Curio on Twitter and Cincy Cabinet of Curiosities on Instagram. And don't forget to join our Facebook group, Hometown Haunts, where you can just chat with other spooky lovers and us on that forum. We're dying to hear about your personal encounters with the paranormal and fringe history from your neck of the woods. Send it to hometownhauntedmail@gmail.com or join and share it on the Facebook group, Hometown Haunts. You can find our podcast wherever you listen and watch, wherever you listen to podcasts and watch our show feed on YouTube. Just find us by searching Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities. Please take a moment to rate and review us on those platforms so other spooky story lovers just like you can find this show. Thank you much in advance. And of course, there is a link in the show notes, and everyone thank Jen for posting the podcast every week, everywhere on the internet. So, for show news, first of all, we went on an exploration around Claremont County. I drugged these two women across some properties. That sounds really weird. You can unmute yourselves and talk about what we did. It was fun and really was the heart of why we started this podcast, which was I found weird places to take them to and then gave them a history lecture on the places when we were standing in the middle of like fields and cemeteries.
It's really great. Yeah. I'm sure neighbors around there, I'm sure the people in that schoolhouse were like peeking out, like, who are those people? What are they doing there? This is really
I never knew the history of that cemetery. That was fun. And with the chickens and the roosters clucking as we were.
Oh, yes. It was so cute when all the chickens ran out.
Yeah, that was.
I just heard the rooster and didn't see him run out.
Yeah, they were bopping around. I was watching them a little bit because there was that old schoolhouse sign, and then I just turned to my left, and there was just a little clouder. Can you say clouder of chickens? Somebody's going to correct me, going, no, a group of chickens is this, and I don't know what it is.
Chickens.
Yeah, a group of chickens.
A group of chickens.
Yeah,
a flock.
There we go. Yeah,
they are birds.
Of chickens. Yeah.
My favorite is a glower of cats.
Well, that one's fun.
It's so true.
Yes. Or a murder of crows. That is my ultimate favorite.
That is mine too.
Yeah.
I like how they hold grudges.
Yes. Yeah, that is true. They do.
And they remember
you. It says flock.
Yeah.
There's not a cute name. The most common collective nouns for a group of chickens are a peep of chickens.
Oh, that's adorable.
Or a brood of chickens.
Ooh, that makes it sound dark and sinister.
Sometimes they can be, from what I understand.
Flock, peep, or brood. I prefer peep myself.
I'm going with brood.
I wonder if that's where peep got their name, or is it because little chicks just
make those little peep sounds and then you rip their marshmallow heads off and with your mouth? Wow. Everyone's going, wow, Kat. Really?
Yeah.
That's how you eat Easter candy? Like Godzilla.
Everybody eats Easter candy that way.
That's true.
Well, yeah. You got to eat the bunny's head first.
Yeah. Put it out of its little sugary misery. Yeah. So, fun. Well, what was the most fun place to go yesterday. I took you to 2 locations, and we'll be talking about both of these in the next few shows, tonight's show and next week's.
Well, I think it's no contest that it was the graveyard. I mean,
Yes.
Yeah.
there wasn't much. The courthouse, because it's newer and just the way a lot of that stuff is styled.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's something slightly depressing about it, which, I mean, obviously we were there to see the Potter's Field, which that's also depressing.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whereas the graveyard was just interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at all the stones, wondering why so many said consort.
I did look that up, and I have an answer.
Ooh, so spoiler, or no.
That's for
stay
next
tuned.
week. Yeah, stay tuned. And as I'm going to write this down on a sticky note, so remember to put this in the episode. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just gonna have a random sticky note that says consort with a bunch of lines underneath it. So at least for the courthouse, they didn't make it modern. It was just a colonial revival style courthouse. So give them some props for some creativity this time and age to put some styling to it. It's not a cement monster.
That's true.
Yeah.
I still liked the courthouse. As you know, I walked across the street and took pictures, and there was the park there was. I mean, now everything's just kind of drab and brown, but to me, there's still a beauty in that. So I enjoy that too. And especially on days like yesterday when it was really nice, it kind of felt like spring was coming, and it kind of gave you that. It was just nice being outside for a little bit. But of course, the cemetery is my favorite too, because it's, dead people and cool
dead people and really cool headstones. I was all about the headstones. And I like the unmarked wooden cross that we found. There was clearly where there was a plaque is probably being fixed, but it was your spooky imagination could go going, who is buried here? Why is it unmarked? Kind of like at the Lima institution's cemetery, there is just headstones that are marked specimens.
Oh.
Yeah, and that one makes your imagination go wild. Or like, what are specimens?
Like people?
They're most likely biological waste pits that they put in the field. But so it's going to be arms, legs, toes.
Did they not have an incinerator back in the day?
Well, it takes a lot of fuel to do that.
True.
And you need to keep it at a constant, I think, over 2,000 degrees for quite a few hours. So it gets expensive to do it that way. It's just easier to dig a hole in the ground and throw parts into it. I mean, that was just easier. It takes a few hours to dig a hole. That's with a few manpower. It's just easier. So and then you already had the cemetery, so why not? Just chuck it in there. So should we do some show notes before moving on to tonight's topic?
Good idea.
Yeah. So we will be at the inaugural Frogman Fest this March 4th at the Great Wolf Lodge Conference Center in Mason, Ohio. We will have copies of both issues of the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities Comics Anthology and cryptid posters and stickers. Friend of the show and author extraordinaire James Willis will be a featured speaker, along with many folklorists, cryptozoologists, and artists from really Ohio and then to the mid-Atlantic area. It's been fun. Frogman Festival has been posting all the different vendors and artists who will be there. And man, there will be an artist for you. There's tarot card readers as well who will be there. I think there's a psychic medium or two. There's really going to be a little bit of anything for everyone. It's $10 a person, but these are fun. These are all local artists. No MLMs to be found so far, which is great. Anyway, and then a little bit later in March, on March 18th, 2023, we'll be at the Highland Heights Comic Con in Northern Kentucky University Student Union. If you are an artist or vendor and are interested in the event, you can still reserve tables via their Kickstarter campaign, which I think tonight may be the last night for it.
I just checked 20 hours, but obviously when this drops, it'll be over.
Okay, so we'll be over by the time this drops. But if you're interested in going, it will be March 18th. And we'll have more information as it develops, of course. So, on to tonight's show, which was excursion number 1 yesterday. So the sources for tonight's show is the Ohio Exploration Society, ClermontCounty.gov, Clermont County History, Clermont County Genealogical Society, the Bethel Journal, the Cincinnati Enquirer, and Cincinnati Magazine. So it got a lot. And it was fun digging through the archives of the newspapers, finding like articles and stuff talking about the infirmary. So before we start talking about Clermont County, we're actually going to go into a history lesson about American poorhouses and the system that they lived in, basically. So it is not uncommon for a county to have a poorhouse, also known as an almshouse before Social Security and other social welfare reforms were enacted in the 20th century. Popularized in England during the mid-19th century, the earliest American poorhouse was built around 1827. Widows, orphans, the elderly, disabled, and infirm and indigent were sent to live or lived at these properties. They were also left sometimes at these properties. They were not a debtor's prison, however, which is what a lot of popular belief thought they were. These were people that just did not have enough money. It wasn't a punishment to live there. They could leave at any time. Most people who arrived at the poorhouse did so because their families, themselves, or even the church communities could no longer provide enough assistance for them. In the case with Clermont County Infirmary, many of the listed residents were elderly. Each poorhouse had a poor master or an overseer of the poor who was an elected town official. Poorhouses were tax-supported residential institutions. However, life was not always stellar there. Poorhouses were expected to be self-sufficient, tending and raising their own livestock, fruits, vegetables on the property by the tenants who were able to do so. So it really mattered on who was the poor master, depended on the quality of the poorhouse at the time. So if you had a great poor master who cared about everybody and put work into it, it was not a bad situation to live in, and pretty good for elderly people at the time because you had a roof over your head, you were warm, and you were fed. If you had a bad poor master, well, then things were a quite different story, and then that's where a lot of ghost stories pop out of. And then a lot of these institutions eventually turn into nursing homes or insane asylums and other things that ghost hunters tend to go to now in the 21st century. Poorhouses were built with optimism in mind. They were truly safe housing for the community who had the greatest need. By the Civil War, there was a great disillusionment of poorhouses, however, and communities started to favor the worthy poor or those who would only temporarily need their assistance. However, the Civil War also caused a great many widows and orphans and elderly family members who suddenly had no family to support them, and wounded veterans who could no longer work. Laws were enacted to help families of wounded veterans, their widows, and other family members using outside relief or providing help outside the poorhouse and prohibiting them from being placed in one. The Civil War pension plan was also created, which aimed to help families of veterans. However clunky it was rolled out. So basically, the outside relief would be money from the taxes given to families to keep them out of the poorhouse. Basically, our social welfare system as we know it today had its early roots right after the Civil War. Post 1875, poorhouses became the jurisdiction of the State Board of Charities. Laws were passed at the time that prohibited children from living in poorhouses and removing those with mental health needs to different facilities, creating a larger orphan and insane asylum system, which I just talked about a minute ago. There is an environment in the Clermont County. In this environment, the Clermont County Infirmary existed in at the time. So most of the people who lived at the infirmary were mentally fit, elderly, and not related to a veteran of the Civil War. So those were the population who lived. Also, because as we talked to Kelly yesterday, who's a historian in Clermont County, this was a big abolitionist neighborhood. Actually, most of Cincinnati was on both the east and west side. And because of that, you had a multicultural residency who lived there. So blacks and whites lived at this Claremont County Infirmary. And we have historical record noting this. So what I really love about this particular location is they really kept meticulous, albeit very difficult to read, logs, basically. Not diaries, but they would meticulously write about everything that happened every single day in extremely beautiful cursive writing that was very difficult to translate. Or transcribe. So, the Claremont County Infirmary history. Before the poorhouse stood, it was the farm of Jacob and Henry G. Duckwall. The city of Batavia purchased 108 acres of land from the Duckwall family for $4,320 when Claremont County commissioners decided there was a need for a house, as they put it, for the paupers of the community. The commissioners found that more property was needed, so they purchased an additional 120 acres of land from Reader W. Clark for $8,400. The poorhouse building was then constructed by George A. Miller with a blueprints compiled by architects Rockin and Hamilton of Cincinnati. It was completed on December 10th, 1857, and cost $4,998 to build, and was used continuously until a fire destroyed it in 1877. The county received $7,800 in insurance compensation for the loss of the building. So, interesting that it was insured. That was not something I ever thought about until I was reading through the historical archives and logs for this building. And I have included a clip of the I just lost where it was. The 1883 Cincinnati Enquirer article saying the Batavia, Ohio, laying a cornerstone. So this is July 28th, 1885, or 1883, Batavia. The cornerstone of the new county infirmary building was laid today, according to Masonic rites, under the direction of Deputy Grand Master Fletcher L. Day of Cincinnati. Reverend H. D. Moore was the orator on the occasion. The ceremonies were witnessed by over 1,600 people. So, that fun party. Look, the cornerstone is going in. Yay! In 1883, the Claremont County began construction of the new county infirmary at a cost of $40,000. So this place was huge compared to the previous building. The new infirmary was completed in 1885 to welcome the residents of the previous poorhouse and all the other community members who needed assistance. The new building had 100 rooms and stood at 4 stories high, and like before, was expected to be self-sufficient as a working farm. We do actually have records of what they raised on the farm. In addition to livestock, they raised corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, cabbage, onions, in addition to chickens, cows, and pigs. So, for the 100 years it was in operation, the building was known as either the infirmary farm, the county home, or the old folks' home. So that made it really fun to research in all the archives because every single news article decided to use a different form of or variation of what I've just read. Yeah, it was great fun late at night going through the archives. In 1965, the residents were moved to other facilities when it closed. However, it was then converted into county offices. In the fall of 2001, the old infirmary was razed, and today the Claremont County Courthouse and Sheriff's Office and jails and their animal shelter now sit on the poorhouse property, which is where I took Jen and Christina to yesterday. However, the jailhouse is built over what used to be the Potter's Field, especially the women's wing. What remains of the Potter's Field has been restored and a sign put up to denote who is buried there and when it was restored. So, yeah, that was fun standing in the middle of basically over 300 acres of property. So basically all the flat bits in that bowl between the hills, that was all the poorhouse property. And that's where people lived, raised all that livestock, and had their fields. So, kind of remarkable when you're standing in a parking lot knowing that you basically were standing in an apple orchard at one point. So, before we move on, a little bit about Paupers Fields. Because I don't think we've actually given a definition on the show as to what one is, even though we've had multiple authors on talking about them. So, a potter's field, also known as a pauper's grave or a common grave, is a place for the burial of the unknown, unclaimed, or indigent people. The most famous potter's field is Hart Island in the Bronx, New York, on the western edge of Long Island Sound. Opened as a city cemetery in 1869, it is 1 mile long and 0.33 miles wide, and in 2018 alone, they buried 1,200 people there. There are over 1 million people, approximately, buried there, according to the New York City Council. In Cincinnati, we have our own Potter's Fields, and they pop up all over the city and the region. Cincinnati Music Hall sits on top of a former Potter's Field. Bones of the dead are dug up whenever we have a renovation of the building. Price Hills Potter's Field has been neglected for years and in 2022 received a National Parks grant for the restoration of the field. Downtown, there was a Potter's Field between 4th and 5th Streets, and on Madison Park, at the corner of Madison Road and Erie Avenue in Hyde Park, used to be a graveyard until 1905 when the bodies were excavated and moved to Spring Grove. These are just some examples of the graveyards and Potter's Fields around the area. There are hundreds more, and possibly your home is sitting on one. Isn't that a cheery thought? Now on to some more cheery thoughts. This is going to be a slight content warning. I'm going to be talking about the people who lived and died on the property and used their names. This is done out of respect of the individuals, so we never forget them and understand why preserving history is so vital to the community. So there is a chance that somebody who is listening to the show tonight may be actually related to the people that lived there. And surprise, this is where they are. So, during the course of the decades that it was a working infirmary, at least 315 people died on the property. We do have the discharge logs for those who had noted destinations of burial in most cases. So, this is where I'm getting this information from. Many residents listed were elderly and are noted of dying of old age, such as, and this is an awesome name, Flavius Davis. I love that name. He passed away in October of 1935. Davis died on the property. His body was sent for burial in Felicity, Ohio, but then it was returned that December to the poor home. He was later buried at Bethel Cemetery, aka Lucy Run Cemetery, a few days after that. There was also quite a few people noted for dying of consumption, such as, it's noted as Geo, but it probably stands for George Harry, who was a black man who died while living there in March of 1885. Consumption and diseases were a leading cause of death in poorhouses across the country, also in orphanages and insane asylums. There was a baby boy born there at the infirmary by the name of Andrew Beagle, who died there the same day, June 4th, 1887. Another find while going through the logs were that the amount of people who ran away from the poor farm and then were returned, or only for their deaths to be learned about and noted later, such as Martin Vanderell in 1915 and Frank Rogers in 1921. Some people ran away but were returned to the infirmary, such as the case for Kirk Fleek, another fun name, in February in 1932, only for him to die on the property that May. Marion Yates ran away from the property in 1924 and returned later that year. She died on the property in 1926. We do know that some of the names of those buried in the Potter's Field, such as John Pelton, who died in 1915, and Chase Baker, who he has an unlisted date and has no direct address where his body was taken for burial, unlike most of the other people. Most people who were buried in the Potter's Field, however, were not noted in this discharge log. So only 2 out of the 315 people that I read through actually were in the Potter's Field and noted as being in such. Well, not in the case of Shays Baker. They, I assume, ended up in the Potter's Field. But anyone who was in the Potter's Field is not noted in the log, and basically their names have been lost to history, at least of this moment. If you like to read through the infirmary's discharge logs, they are kept at the University of Cincinnati Carl Belgian Library in the Regional Archives. So that's where you can go to read this log that I took this information from. Now, of course, because this building is so old and has a reputation, it is rumored to be haunted. So, when the infirmary was still standing, it was said to be haunted by the apparitions of men and women wearing disheveled clothes and looking out the windows of the old building. It was said that lights flickered in the building even when there was no electricity hooked up to it near the end before it was raised back in 2001. The reports of hauntings escalated when the building was abandoned in the early 2000s. It really wasn't abandoned, it was just sold and demolished, but anyway. And unsurprisingly, this is also when there were a bunch of urban explorers exploring the building before it was raised. I hedge to bet, and this is just editorial here, they were probably hearing each other on different floors, spooking one another without knowing it. But that's just me in knowing the community. Many of those who died in the infirmary are buried in the nearby Potter's Field off Filliger Road. So the Potter's Field is located just north of the jail off of Filliger Road, a little bit raised on the hillside back there. It was not easy to get to, even though it is noted in many newspaper articles because its proximity to the jail. And the case with the three of us, we didn't really want to get the attention of the sheriff's office, which is also on the property, like we were casing the place. So we just stayed in the parking lots and in the public areas where we were supposed to be as residents, basically. So, and the Potter's Field mostly is taken up now by the jailhouse, so it's hard to take photos of that anyway. But we did take some photos of the courthouse. The women's wing of the jail seems to have the most reported paranormal activity on the property, according to local urban legend. That wing of the jailhouse, like the rest of it, is built on a section of Potter's Field that we know definitely was a Potter's Field, something only discovered after its construction. Ghostly figures are said to occasionally roam the halls as if they are looking for their graves and eternal rest, which was disrupted by the construction of the jail. So the hauntings are, by all accounts, still persisting to this day. I can only imagine when it was still before 2001, going into work and seeing basically the haunting image of a woman in in disheveled clothes floating down the hallway, going through the doors. I wonder if they had cold spots, if they had more than just electrical problems, things like that. So that is all the information about the Claremont County Infirmary that I have to share. I am wondering what your comments are on it.
You just
I thought it was really interesting. I went to school in Felicity, and even
there's a lot of people who lived at that poor farm that were buried in Felicity.
It's a very poor area. Even when I went there, that's the school I went to that was K through 12, and I don't even know if it was 500 students.
Oh wow.
In rural areas, they cover a huge area. It's interesting because this report you put together really calls attention to rural poor in a way, because a lot of times media tends to pay more attention to urban poor because they're around, you see them, but actually urban poor probably are, and this is a horrible way to put it, in a way it's better to be poor in an urban setting because at least there's places to go. When you're in rural poor areas, there's nowhere to go. There's not a place you can walk to get food or
the
whatever.
resources are far scarcer in rural areas. And definitely there was a very I won't say well-known poorhouse that was in Ohio. It has since been razed because it was struck by lightning and caught fire once it was abandoned. Was the Knox County poorhouse. Every
Hmm.
single one of the counties in the state of Ohio had a poorhouse at one point. And some of them were razed, some of them were remodeled and turned into nursing homes or other facilities. Knox County, I'm not so sure of the history. It was trying to be put on the National Register of Historic Places because the same architect that worked on the ridges in Athens, Ohio, also did Knox. And it had some very distinct roof work that was special,
Hmm.
and they could not get it the distinction in time, and basically the owners let it rot, and then it got struck by lightning and caught on fire and a few years ago, maybe about a
Wow.
decade ago now. But it was a very common place for urban explorers to break into, and it was very spooky, and also a lot of hauntings were said to come out of there.
Hmm.
So, also, was it Pythian? Pythian homes were also really common. So, but those are slightly different than poor homes.
Hmm. It seems like it also draws attention to the dealing with people that are poor, especially elderly poor, is still a
Mhm.
problem today. I mean,
Yes.
if you look at housing for the elderly and that sort of thing, it is still, they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
It is still a problem, and families, I mean, and I don't know if they're, perhaps eventually they will have some sort of way to help pay family members so that they can work to take care of their elderly relatives, but I can only imagine back in the 1800s, it was even worse because,
Mhm.
again, there's no resources. When you look at, if you were in Felicity today, it's still pretty remote, or Moscow or Bethel or any of those
Mhm.
areas out there. There's some beautiful areas there. There are some nice homes there, but it is very rural. I remember when we lived in Moscow, Ohio, this is when I was going to Felicity, we decided we were going to walk to, there was a little tiny, what would you call it, like a convenience store, kind of a 7-Eleven kind of, but it was a couple,
Mhm.
it's like four, it was miles away.
Mhm.
And we walked there. I mean, fortunately, my mom actually eventually drove and picked us up, but it was
Mhm.
for a bunch of kids. Kids were given a little more leeway back then. We walked there, and, it was really a long walk that was hilly.
Yeah.
But imagine if you had no resources. I mean, talk about a food desert.
Mhm.
Obviously, there are people that live off hunting and growing their own produce and stuff, but they're still extremely poor.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And, what I did like was the, mentioning of the churches that would try to keep people out of the poorhouse themselves, like community members.
Mhm,
And, yeah, until it eventually got to the point where they could not help anymore, and people would be moved into the poorhouse.
mhm.
So, I do know, at least in New Jersey, that you can be paid to take care of family members by the federal government.
Oh,
You have
that's
to take
good.
several classes and get some certifications, but
Mhm,
those kind of programs do exist, and not so many people know about it, which is important as our boomer generation gets older, knowing how to be able to take care of them in a dignified manner,
mhm.
basically. And this is me talking as somebody who has a silent generation parent who is in elder care. So,
There was a
learned a
Simpsons
lot.
episode, it said everybody, all future jobs will be elder care.
Yeah, they're not lying. So, yeah,
Mhm.
it's hard work, and no, I tip my hat to all the people who do work in elder care and
But
elder
yeah, it's
nursing.
extremely
Yeah.
stressful, it's a lot of work, the hours. I was just reading an article about, I forget, they were talking about the difficulty getting people to work in the facilities we have today, and they were
Mhm.
saying, if you're a Dairy Queen, you don't, if you don't have staff, you can close, but you can't do that with a facility because those require 24-hour a day care.
Yeah, they do.
And if
And
anything, it's probably worse at night.
it does, especially in, like, dementia wings where people, sunset, which is when everyone's temperament takes a 180 and they get a lot more grumpy and throw things. But, yeah, yeah, it takes a lot. They really should be paid accordingly to that. But getting back to the potter's field and the poorhouse, one of the questions that I always had and never really, it was in the back of my mind, and I finally got an answer for it, was why on earth, where Cincinnati Music Hall is today in Washington Park, it used to be a sane asylum, it was an orphanage, and then it was the Hamilton County Poor Home, and then the Potter's Field, all on that side of what is it, Elm Street that they're on? And I couldn't figure out for a while why we had 3 large buildings dedicated to these different segments of the population until reading about those acts passed after the Civil War that denoted that children could not be put in poor homes. They had to be put in orphanages, and to protect the population of the poor homes, we had the people that were deemed mentally unwell moved into a different facility. So, it was because violence by anybody was quite high at that time. So, it was interesting because I always had that question and I never quite knew how to phrase it until reading the research about this location and went, aha, that's why we had 3 different facilities for this different groups of the community and the Potter's Field. And then across the street where Washington Park is, there was also the Presbyterian and Episcopal cemeteries, which are, whenever they do renovations on Washington Park, they're basically scooping up a bunch of Presbyterians and Episcopals and putting them in Spring Grove Cemetery.
An
So,
interesting way of looking at it.
yeah, it's just
So,
like,
what is the difference between an infirmary like this and when we went to the place in Marietta? Because that was also a,
that
I don't
was
want
an
to,
elder care facility. That was a
there's a lot
mansion.
of, but you had mentioned there was a lot of elder care here too. It was a lot of elderly
So,
poor.
it was interesting reading the articles about the infirmary, and it's interesting that they only referenced it really as the infirmary. They never called it a poorhouse, even though that's what it was. And I think it was to give a lot more dignity to the people living there, because there's still a stigma of, oh, hey, this person, let's say John Smith, is living in the poorhouse versus saying John Smith is elderly and living in the infirmary or the infirmary farm. There's just a little bit more dignity sounding to the
Hmm.
person who's the audience of whatever is being spoken. So that may be it. Um, Marietta, the Anchorage, was, for those who may have missed that episode, we went on a ghost hunt at the Anchorage, and that was a 19th century mansion that was turned into a nursing home in the 1960s and was kept until the 1980s as a private nursing home. So there's another denotation. That was a private nursing home versus a public almshouse or poorhouse. So that was just taxpayer funds for the infirmary, private for the nursing home. And also the amount of people were supposed to be different, even though I don't think the Anchorage actually kept their population down. They had them everywhere in the hallway and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, and the type of care expected, from what I can tell with the infirmary, there were no nurses coming in and helping people. This was, you just lived there as a tenant, kind of like a dormitory, and you just helped it function. Like you go picking the tomatoes, feeding the chickens, stuff like that. They may
Hmm.
have had a cook though. And then you also had the poorhouse master.
Hmm. Now, one thing we've all heard from A Christmas Carol was the workhouse.
Mm-hmm.
Was that just? And there was actually a documentary I watched recently on that from the BBC. How was that mostly a British thing, or did that also come over to the
I
United
think there
States?
were more workhouses on the East Coast. I do
Hmm.
remember them in Rhode Island and Providence because of the textile industry that was out there. And I think the idea of a poorhouse originated from the workhouse. And definitely both of those were British thing like ideas to come up with housing the people who are working and the people that were paupers or not able to pay for their own apartments basically.
Hmm.
So The workhouses, I think, were just for people working in a factory or a textile mill, and you were not being paid, but only by having a place to live and food. So versus, um, this is a potter's field, so kind of you're working, you're making your rent basically by working the farm, but
Mhm.
it's only for your benefit because it's nothing's being outsourced. It's all internal. Now, I will note that this did not happen at Claremont County. It did happen at older establishments out east and along the Mid Atlantic. There is an idea of indentured servitude that would happen. People that were in poor homes or almshouses would be auctioned off by um, basically the poor masters, and they would work for a certain period of time, like 1 to 3 years, at farms around the poorhouse. And then those families who had purchased them for that period of time would feed and house them, and that was a way of getting outside relief in a way. But this did not happen in Claremont County. That entire system had been abolished by the time the Claremont County buildings were created. So I do want to put that those do exist. They happened in older poorhouse homes. They were not the case in Claremont County. So, and this was
Mhm.
also not a debtor's prison. No one was stuck there and they can never leave. People ran away, but I did not hear negative stories at all. Though then again, who's telling the tales? Who wrote the logs?
Mhm. Mhm.
So, who's in control of the narrative? But if you have any of our listeners' stories about the infirmary, visited it before it was raised, or have ghost stories, please write into hometown haunted mail at
At Gmail.
gmail.com.
Mhm.
We would love to hear them. This is definitely a section of regional history that does not have a lot written about it, and would be fascinating to write more about it, because this is really how a lot of our forefathers, forebears, this happened to them. They lived this way. We should be learning about it. So that is just my call out for all of those who have stories from Claremont County and really anywhere around the area.
Mhm.
I'm including Indiana and I'm including Kentucky in that call out too.
We should check that Erie Appalachia book and see if there's anything that takes place in that area, in the
Oh yeah.
Claremont County. There's got to be some hollers that have. I mean, it really is a very Appalachia area. I
Mhm.
mean, it kind of goes into that where you kind of go into rural Kentucky, rural Ohio. All
Mhm.
of these areas were probably settled by similar people and are extremely poor, actually.
Yeah. Kind of like for next week we are talking about Lucy Run Cemetery, and that was also a family that lived out in West Virginia and came or originally Maryland. West Virginia was a stop, and then they settled here in, well, in I almost said Bavaria, but no. Uh,
Batavia.
thank you.
Batavia, Bavaria, they're almost the same.
I have Oktoberfest suddenly on the brain. I don't know why. Anyway, um,
Ready for a beer, I
I
think.
guess so. I'm ready for a beer. But yeah, it's this is all the small regional, not small as in it doesn't matter, but small as in super hyper regional stories that we really need. As an anthropologist, I have a lot of interest in collecting and really preserving these stories. And they don't have to be ghost stories, because
Mhm.
just we don't have a lot of information that was written down and preserved um, for by people, the everyday person in America in the 19th century. I mean, we have worker logs from factories, but we don't have too many logs from farming communities because
Mhm.
people just didn't think. I don't know why they didn't write it down. Actually,
I
there's
remember
very
when we
few.
when we first moved there, everybody grew tobacco. Like every barn you saw had tobacco hanging in it, and everybody had like a little field where they grew tobacco.
I can see that. That's how they got through the Great Depression in Ohio. They sold
Mhm.
tobacco, like, and then rum runned a lot for all the bootleggers. But
Yes, yes. I'm sure there's still quite a lot of interesting stuff that happens in those very rural areas. I
yes.
mean, the population is very thin. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
for our school district, I mean, our school bus ride every morning was at least a couple of hours each way because you
Yeah.
have to cover such a huge area because there aren't that many students.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine how much these districts cost the state of Ohio because there's no tax base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
There's a
that
little
is.
tax base, but not much.
Yeah, and not enough. Yeah, it's growing up. My high school was 3 townships worth of children. That sounds weird. High schoolers. There we go. That sounds better. 3 townships, and it took 45 minutes by bus for me to get to school. So
Wow.
Mhm.
it was worse when it snowed.
Oh,
Oh,
Just
yeah.
sounds awful.
yeah.
We had it.
So
There was a snowstorm once when we were going to Felicity, and the bus just couldn't make it. Like the
mhm.
roads were very windy and very hard to. I mean, it was like very hilly
Yeah,
and
it
like
was fun
well,
driving
well, yeah, you saw
yesterday.
those roads. So imagine those roads. It was snowing, and the bus driver just let us off. Like it was over a mile from our house. But
Yeah.
fortunately, we were able to stay at a neighbor's house till my mom picked us up.
Well, that is very good.
So we walked down their long driveway to
Yeah.
stay with them
Well,
because we were wimpy kids. We were like, we're not walking this. We'll stay
no,
at our
that's why,
friends.
like, I know in rural Indiana, this is definitely a thing. You would have a bus stand built at the end of your driveway, and you
Mhm.
just stood there and waited for the bus to come. And it was a sheltered, it basically looks like a roofed coffin at the end of a
Mhm.
driveway. And it's not, it's supposed to be where school kids would go and wait for the school bus, and you had shelter from the rain or the snow or whatnot. We did not have one. I just sat in a car and waited for the bus with my mom or my dad, but at least it was heated in that case.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's interesting because as education's discussed, I mean, it's kind of amazing that they educate everybody in these rural areas and the funds that they put so people can read and write all over. I mean,
Hmm.
back in these times, most of these people probably couldn't read. There was no education. I mean, there
Yeah,
wasn't probably a lot of prospects
right. There was a
for,
limited amount of education happening, and even less if you were a woman.
well,
So,
yes, that goes without saying. I mean, and, where you were describing, I mean, it wasn't just war that took people away. They probably just died. You could die hunting by the creek or fall down a cliff, or there were
hmm
so many ways that you could and leave a family behind or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah. Illness is what took out a lot of these families.
Mhm.
Um, I know from my research in Indiana, in equally rural Indiana, cholera
Mhm.
and yellow fever took out a
Mhm.
lot of people, and we had epidemics that flew through these towns
Mhm.
about once a decade. It would just kill off so many
Mhm.
people, and we saw that in the cemetery yesterday,
Yes.
where we would just see groups of people that died within days of each other. It was most
Mhm.
likely tuberculosis and cholera. Yellow fever was another one. And people kind of forget that these epidemics do come through and killed people before vaccines existed. So
Mhm. And
I'm
it's
going
not
to
like
leave
you could
that
get to a
topic
doctor.
there, though. So
It's not like you could get to a doctor either. I mean, now
No.
it's probably hard. I mean, that's one of the hardest thing is I was just reading another article where it was talking about rural hospitals and
oh
facilities
yeah,
are just closing because there's no money.
yeah.
There's no money.
So back in the day, doctors would have a house with their practice in it. They usually went to you. So
Mhm.
unless you needed a surgery, and then in Cincinnati, in this area, it was possible for people to go to the city to get
Mhm.
surgery, but in more advanced care, but most likely your doctors, and there would be a local surgeon around, would be here to take care of you. Were
Mhm.
they also the livestock vet? Sometimes, yes, but most of the time they were a dedicated doctor.
They knew how to stitch stuff up,
Yeah, they knew. Yeah. But
saw
moving
things off.
on to tonight's hometown haunt.
This is from Sarah. I work at a cemetery. We don't necessarily believe in hauntings, but there is one very peculiar thing that happens here that we cannot explain nor rectify. There is one cylindrical monument that keeps rolling off its base. The monument is easily a few hundred pounds on its own and not so easily rolled. We have trail cameras on it and have never seen any cause. Most recently, our crew used epoxy to fix it permanently. That fix lasted maybe a week. The stone is for a woman whom we believe died alone, filled with grief for a husband who passed during the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. After her husband's death, she lived with her son, and the newspaper clippings from their times of death led me to believe things were acrimonious. I'd have to delve back into the details, but those are the highlights I remember. That's fascinating.
Have you seen that happen before, where somebody keeps moving something?
There is something, and when she started writing, and I'm like, oh, I think I know. Until she said San Francisco, I was like, oh my goodness, this is in Ohio. And then she threw me that curveball and went, oh, there's another one. So there is something known as the Merchant Ball of Marion, Ohio, and you can look it up. It's like immediately, it's on Atlas Obscura was the first website that popped up. But I actually know about this from our friend James Willis, and he has it in Weird, Ohio. And this is a headstone that has a sapphire on the top, and it keeps rolling. No one knows why. They put a little dot on it, and you can mark basically day by day as it's moving, and it's just
Oh, that's
making
weird.
rolling, and no one knows why, and it's been studied as well. So, and there have been attempts to epoxy it to fix it to keep it from rolling as well, and those have failed. It's moving very slowly. It's not like it's you walk up to the headstone and it's like this moving artwork. It's not doing that, but it is moving. So this is not the only monument that is in motion that I've heard about. So this is a great story. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. I wonder if it's like ground vibrations or something.
It's aliens.
Aliens. It's always aliens.
It's always aliens.
Please understand,
aliens.
listeners, that I say that with a sincere just sarcasm.
But we don't.
Yeah.
Some people truly believe, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, there is not. So
just a little
it's the
wishful
little
thinking.
kitty cat one that goes, it's aliens.
Oh.
Yeah. But that is really interesting. I love this story. So thank you, Sarah.
Very well written, too.
Well,
Not that others haven't been, but that was a very
they're all well written, but this one's
clear story. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, on that note.
Yes. So on that note, thank you everyone for joining us again on this wonderful episode of the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities Hometown Haunts podcast. I am Kat Cloco. Along with me for this fun expedition into the unknown is Christina Wald and Jen Kohler. You can follow us at Sin Cabinet Curio on Twitter and at Cincy Cabinet of Curiosities on Instagram. And please join us on our Facebook group, Hometown Haunts. And there are people chatting all week long, and we will pop in and share interesting news that we find from around the world. So anyway, good night, stay safe, and stay spooky.
Bye.
Bye.